Madam Speaker, and I'm glad to be able to participate in the debate and appreciate the opportunity to speak. Madam Speaker, this is not the first time which I've stood on my feet and spoken in the House, but it is the first time since my election last year that I've had the opportunity to perhaps in a little slightly more reflective way thank my constituents for sending me here twice in a by-election and now in a general election, and to say how proud I am to represent the constituency of Toronto Centre. It's a riding in which my father grew up. He went to Jarvis Collegiate and then to the University of Toronto, and had it not been for a $250 scholarship which he received upon entry in 1932, he would not have been able to attend university. I know there are many members opposite who've called me many things, but to which I take no particular objection. But I'm very proud of my constituency. I'm very proud of my association with the riding of Toronto Centre, and I'm very proud to represent it here today. It's a riding of enormous diversity. I know there are a great many people in the country who like to take some exception to Toronto and might have a certain perhaps picture or stereotype in their minds about it. But if I can, Madam Speaker, describe it to you, my riding goes from the lake to north of Rosedale. It goes from the Don Valley Parkway over to Yonge Street, makes a couple of other small jogs, but it includes, in that very narrow geographical space, I know there are many, many members of Parliament who represent ridings that are 100 and 200 and 500 square kilometres, and mine is much smaller than that. But it's an intensely diverse riding where immigrants come. It's their first point of entry. It's their first point of staying. In St. Jamestown, we have perhaps the most densely populated part of, I would argue, part of the country, where we have literally tens of thousands of people living within a square block. It obviously well known when the riding was known as Toronto Rosedale. It includes some of the wealthiest parts of the country in terms of its constituents. It also includes Regent Park, which, as many members will know, is one of the oldest public housing developments in the country, and includes some of the least well-off people in the country. We have a large Aboriginal population. We have a large gay population. We represent the diversity of Canada and the diversity of the world, and it is a constituency which I'm very, very proud to represent. Now, Madam Speaker, as has already been referred to by some of the members who spoke earlier, this is not my first time in the House of Commons. I was first elected here in 1978, which is, I don't need to tell the members present, over 30 years ago. This is my 36th year in which I turned 60 and in which I celebrate my 30th anniversary of my election to the House of Commons. And next to my colleague, my seatmate, who's not here, he's being impersonated by somebody else at the moment, but my seatmate, the member from Regina, Wisconsin, who was elected in 1974, I think I can speak with some confidence of some history that we've had here with respect to the country. I want to speak about our budgets. I want to speak about Canada's recessions. I want to speak perhaps in a way that will disappoint some people, because it will not be an intensely partisan speech, because I want to try to reflect a little bit, Madam Speaker, if I may, on some of the challenges we face as a country, on the moment at which we are dealing with this intense economic crisis, and perhaps compare and contrast it with some of the challenges which we faced in the past, and I'm speaking here from personal experience. I was the finance critic of the New Democratic Party for 3 years and saw budgets come and go, the budget of the Conservatives, of the Liberals at the time, and it was a time when we were entering into a serious recession in the late 1970s and 1980s. And I would remind members, and in fact not remind them, but in the case of many of the younger members, actually tell them, when Mr. Crosby brought in his budget in 1979, that budget had a provision for a deficit of just over $7 billion. It's a budget that also called for an increase in the taxation on gasoline of some 18 cents a liter, and there's some colleagues who will remember the arguments about that and how that went forward. That budget was defeated, Mr. Speaker. It was then followed by an election in which the Liberals were elected, and then the recession took hold full bore and full steam. And it was a very difficult recession. It was a recession which saw unemployment in some parts of the country go to over 20%, and in the case of the national average, we went well up over 11 and 12%. It was a budget which was accompanied by a long national debate on the National Energy Program, which proved to be extremely divisive and difficult for the entire country, in which we saw oil prices literally collapse, which seemed to be, from the point of view of the consumer, a good thing. From the point of view of the producing provinces, a very difficult thing. And so we saw a recession which in its general impact was shared very much across the country. And by the time the Trudeau government was defeated by Mr. Mulroney, the last Liberal budget, which was brought in by the Honourable Marc Lalonde, contained a deficit of well over $40 billion. And it was a time when people were really unsure as to whether these techniques of priming the pump would actually work, whether it would have the desired effect. Under the Mulroney government, that deficit went down. There was a very quick transition out of the recession that took place in the province of Ontario starting in around 1983 and 84, something of which I'm familiar because I had by that time shifted from the federal scene to the provincial scene. And we saw a very steady increase in employment and a very steady increase in the health of the economy from 1984 to 1989, to the point where the Peterson government was able to introduce the first surplus, balanced budget in Ontario's history for over 25 years. It had been 25 years of deficits in Ontario, and it had been steady deficits in Canada from the early 1970s until 1998. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've had occasion, some of my colleagues may have read it in the National Post. Madam Speaker, I've had opportunities to make fun of a little bit of how I've somehow given up my title of being the deficit punching boy to punching bag to my colleagues across the way. And all I intended by that article, which I'm glad to say was struck a certain note with some people, is simply this, that I know that we went through a period when, as a country, we made a collective decision that deficits added upon deficit, regardless of whether the country was in recession or whether we were in growth or whether we were in a remarkably healthy state, was dangerous territory for the economy of Canada. And I can tell you, and I know that this is often not accepted as the fact, but the simple fact of the matter is that all the premiers agreed, regardless of political party, in the early 1990s, and I can remember very vividly the conversation at which it took place. It was the night before a premiers' conference in 1992, and there were premiers there from the New Democratic Party, from the Liberal Party, from the Conservative Party, and an informal discussion before our normal First Minister's meeting. We went over the ground of what we were facing in our economies, and we had a very candid discussion about how challenging it was, how difficult it was, how hard the fiscal and financial situation that we were facing in the early 1990s, the impact that it was having on all of our budgets, and how we had a responsibility to deal with this, because in the long term, Canada was only going to be better off if we could manage our public finances in a better and healthier way. And we all made the moves that we had to make to get there. And they were painful moves. They were not easy. They were difficult. When Mr. Martin became the Minister of Finance in 1993, the first budget was not a tough budget. The second budget was a tough budget. And the 1995 budget, which really started the country on the way to a steady reduction in the deficit and to an improvement in our overall financial situation, was not simply the product of the political will of the Chrétien-Martin government. It was a product of prosperity and growth taking place. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that we all like to take credit for surpluses, and we all like to allocate blame for deficits. But the simple fact of the matter is that it's the overall state of the economy that by and large determines where our fiscal and financial policy is headed. And that's why I have taken no joy in saying to this government that I believe that they have seriously underestimated for a long period of time the difficulties and the challenges which they were going to face and which any governments are going to face in the face of the economic change which we're going through. One of the things that I learned in 1990 when I became Premier, Madam Speaker, was that the estimates one gets from finance officials when things start going wrong usually underestimate how wrong they're going. People usually overestimate the revenue numbers that you're going to be getting, and they usually underestimate the costs that are associated with a recession. There's no magic here, folks. I look around the room and I just say, what is happening is so clear. It's tragic to say that we should have learned these lessons long ago. The revenue situation facing the government of Canada, just as it's facing all of the provinces, is going to get worse, and the cost side is also going to get worse. And that's why when I look at the numbers which the Minister of Finance presented in his economic statement in the fall, I found it absolutely unbelievable, literally unbelievable. I could not believe that a Minister of Finance would produce that kind of a statement just as the world was heading into this maelstrom, this hurricane. Now, Madam Speaker, I'm not claiming to be any kind of financial guru. If I was, I'd be somewhat substantially better off than I am today. But I would say to honourable members that the recession which we're going through today is of a different character than the one we went through in the 1980s and the 1990s. As difficult as those recessions were, and they were very difficult, and certainly the one that was focused on Ontario in the early 1990s was very tough. Our unemployment rate went up from 5% to over 11%. We lost over 300,000 jobs in a 15-month period. And I hear the numbers coming out today, and I know exactly how bewildering sometimes these numbers can be, and StatsCan gets it wrong, and everybody gets it wrong, and there's no obfuscation in this. There's no conspiracy anywhere. It's just recognizing that as human beings we don't have all the answers, and we don't know exactly what's going on, except what we do know is what we're facing today is even more serious than was faced before. Now, Madam Speaker, I've often heard it said that you can't spend your way out of a recession. Well, actually, it really depends. You can't do it on your own. And I certainly discovered that as Premier of Ontario. When you're facing high interest rates and cuts in federal transfers, to try to reflate from the base of one province doesn't work. And it causes problems and challenges, which we face in Ontario. On the other hand, what we're facing today and what we're seeing today is an unparalleled argument, not just from one government, but from a whole series of governments, that something dramatic has to happen because of the credit crisis. The credit crisis in which certain bad loans were allowed to be syndicated, and having been syndicated became a kind of virus which has infected the entire financial system. That is unparalleled. There is no comparison to what we faced before. Interest rates are low. One can argue and debate this ad infinitum, but the tax structure is imperfect and could readily be improved, and there are serious problems with it. But it's not acting contrary to the possibilities for growth and investment, by and large, in Canada, any more than it is in any other country. And still we're facing the signs of a recession that is not coming quickly to a conclusion. But I think it's fair enough to say that most financial experts believe, and most economists believe, indeed the head of the IMF believes very clearly, that the worst is not yet over and that there's still very difficult times to come. Now, I know the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance accused the members of the opposition in taking pleasure in the terrible numbers. I want to assure him that is not the case. No rational person certainly not one representing a constituency like mine, and we all represent different constituencies where this is the case. Nous représentons tous des comtés.
We all represent ridings. We see the difficulties experienced by people. We see it in our constituency offices. We see it in the number of people who contact us who are in difficulty, who are experiencing very hard circumstances. And it's for that reason, Madam Speaker, that we saw quite a remarkable turnabout by the government. Is it perfect? Is the budget perfect? No, I wouldn't say so. Is it a budget that is similar, that would be the same as that of my leader or a Liberal finance minister? Absolutely not. But does it give us some kind of basis for discussion and refer this to a committee? Yes, in my opinion, on balance, yes. It's not because I think it's perfect. I have a lot of difficulties with some of the parts of the document presented, but I must say that since the economic statement made by the finance minister a couple of months in November, and the budget we see here today, you need a completely ideological approach to say that there is no change here, that there's no change of opinion and no change in policy.
I am not an ideological person. I try not to be. I try to be practical. I don't like the Conservative government. I don't like Conservative ideology. I've never made any pretense that I have. Most of them don't like me. So it's the way it is. No. It's too late. It's too late. It's too late. It's all down in print. It's all down in print. Madam Speaker, I say this, however, I say it's very difficult for me to say that there's been no change from the statement made by the Minister of Finance in November and the budget which has been presented. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect document. But it is a basis for discussion, which is really what we're doing. We're sending this to committee. The committee will have an opportunity to discuss it. And I want to just raise, in the time available to 2 minutes that are left to me, Madam Speaker, to raise the issues that I want to discuss. I am very concerned by the cuts in science and research and in higher education. I wrote a report for Premier McGuinty on the importance of that sector, and I'm disturbed that the Government of Canada has not moved in the right direction. I do believe there's a fundamental question about employment insurance. It's a tax. People pay the tax. The Minister said today there are 20% of the people who pay the tax who will not qualify for employment insurance under any scenario. I want to find out more about who those people are and why she thinks that's equitable and fair. I want to deal with the question of pay equity because I want to listen very carefully to what my friends in the New Democratic Party are saying, and I want them to have a look again at the legislation and try to see whether there isn't a way of resolving what I do not believe is a vast ideological chasm between the legislation and what we all think needs to happen. I'm concerned about what's happened to some provinces, and in particular I'm concerned about the treatment of provinces who feel that the changes that have been made in transfers have been made in a way that is not fair. And finally, I'm very concerned about the question of the affordability of infrastructure. The government needs to have a practical look at what is the actual debt level of many of the cities and municipalities across the country and also of the provinces to understand what impact is that going to have on the take-up rate. Is there not a better way to get those transfers to the municipalities? Because it seems to me that's a critical question. And finally, Madam Speaker, I want to just close on the question of pensions. If there's any public policy area that I do not believe this House has discussed in sufficient detail or with sufficient knowledge, it's the question of pensions. We face a tremendous challenge in the private sector. We face not just the people whose pension funds are underfunded as a result of what's happened. We also face the fact that there are literally millions and millions of employees who do not qualify for pensions and who do not have pensions. We have relied on CPP and RRSP. There are a great many Canadians in the millions who do not have any RRSP money and who are going to be left in retirement in great difficulty, Madam Speaker. So those are questions and issues that I think need to be dealt with in the budget. Should the budget be defeated? At this stage, Madam Speaker, I do not believe that it should. And I hope that my reflections will give the House a chance to move this bill into committee and have it discussed in greater detail. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member, the Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to follow up the speech made by the Honourable Member, who says that there have been changes, and had there not been changes, it would have meant that we were disconnected from reality. We saw the events of the worldwide recession have a negative effect in a few months, and the budget was to take into account this dimension. We went from a budget totaling about $1 billion in surplus, and we noted quickly that everything was crumbling, so we have an anticipated deficit instead. And when we go from $1 billion in surplus to, for the coming year, have a $34 billion deficit, that shows you that this is a major situation that is developing, and the government has a duty to support our economy when the private sector is reducing its investments. We know that we're an exporting country, and our companies see that people aren't buying, so they have to reduce their productivity level and even lay people off. For all of those reasons, it's important for the government to compensate for the reduction on the private sector side by investing massively in infrastructure. In fact, we will be investing $12 billion over the next 2 years. We've supported the automobile sector, and we want to help the forestry industry as well by giving a tax credit for those who want to renovate their homes. And if people renovate their homes, then there will be more economic activity. This will help the forest industry. This will help manufacturers who produce home renovation products, and people will be encouraged to buy a first home or a new home. They'll get a credit for a first home, and there are also improvements to EI. I believe the member for Toronto Centre and the party that he represents felt that this was the right way to go. Of course, a budget can't do everything. It can't be perfect, but I'm sure the member will acknowledge that we have made efforts to support the Canadian economy, companies, and the least privileged. I'd like to give the Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre an opportunity to respond to these comments if he wishes to do so. The Honourable Member for Toronto Centre. I believe it was a comment and not a question. All that I can say is that, in my personal opinion, you continue to underestimate the impact of the world recession on Canada. The figures that were presented, I'd like to remind the Honourable Member to address his remarks to the Chair. Yes, Madam Speaker, I apologize. I would tell the Honourable Member that or rather the Minister, I would tell the Minister that I believe that the government continues to underestimate the scope of the problem, and that is why we maintain that the size of the measures that you've put forward are probably not what is required to face the problem. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Gaspésie-Île-de-la-Madeleine. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I listened with a certain degree of interest to the speech by the Honourable Member for Toronto Centre, and I wondered how he would manage to get his point across, because there are very great difficulties, and I'd like to hear what he has to say about these great difficulties with the budget. So there are problems with the budget. Even so, he will be supporting this government, which a few weeks ago denied the truth about what was happening. And the government continues to deny this truth because there are no measures to help the unemployed who today are losing their jobs or have lost a job or could lose a job. And that's why I'd like to hear what the Honourable Member for Toronto Centre has to say. I'd like him to tell us about the problems with the budget, and why is it that these problems are serious enough to prevent him from supporting that type of budget. The honourable member for Toronto Centre. Well, Madam Speaker, I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm just trying to provide my experience as someone who has experienced 3 recessions, and I would say that I'm not satisfied with the measures that have been brought forward by the government, but I can't say, as you've just said, that there is absolutely nothing in the budget that helps the unemployed. That's not the case. And you can't say that. You can't say something that isn't true. We have to speak the truth. We have to say that measures are not sufficient, or that there's room for improvement, that we'd like to see some changes. And in my experience, if the government is open and open-minded, then changes can be made in committee, changes that will meet the needs of people. Questions and comments?
From Trinity Spadina.
Why is the member afraid to make amendments in this budget? That would increase maybe an extra person, extra unemployed person in Toronto Centre that would receive employment insurance in this budget. Right now, not an extra person will be eligible because of any of these clauses in this budget. Why wouldn't the member move an amendment to exempt municipalities like Toronto for matching the funds on infrastructures? Because Toronto has already put in $1.6 billion. It cannot match any more funds, so it cannot really access this infrastructure funds that is in this budget. Why wouldn't that member move that amendment? Why wouldn't the member move an amendment to say to cancel the cuts on the on signs and cancel the cuts on green technology? And Section 399 on Human Rights Acts on the pay equity. Why wouldn't the member delete that clause right now here in this House?
The honourable member from Toronto Centre.
Well, Madam Speaker, I hope I get some time to respond at least to one of the issues, and that's the pay equity issue, which was raised by my friend from Hamilton East as well as by my friend from Winnipeg North. I'd ask him to have a look at the legislation because the member from Winnipeg North said that it got rid of the notion of equal pay for work of equal value. But on page 358, the preamble to the Act states, whereas Parliament affirms that women in the public sector of Canada should receive equal pay for work of equal value. That's what it says. It's right there in the Act. So what the government has done, and I'm not convinced it's altogether the right thing, but what the government has done is said, make the obligation to live up to the principles of the Act a proactive obligation of the employer, make it a provision of collective bargaining, build it into the collective bargaining process, make the Public Sector Staff Relations Board responsible for the legislation. Don't make it a long legal process that takes 10 to 12 or 15 years and goes to the Human Rights Act, and gives to the Public Sector Labour Relations Board the power and the authority to deal with the question. Now, I'm not saying this is perfect. I'm happy to listen to the criticisms and the concerns. My colleague from Hamilton East put the pressure on me and said all the great things that our government did between 1990 and 1995. We had the most progressive pay equity legislation in the world in Ontario in those years. But we also insisted that it was the Pay Equity Commission that should take responsibility for supervising and overseeing the conduct of collective bargaining and the approach and the improvements that were made. You can't say that the old system was perfect, because the old system federally has put a tremendous obligation on individuals and on unions to take complaints to the Human Rights Commission that has nothing to do with the collective bargaining process and that delays things for a very long period of time. So I would say to my colleagues in the New Democratic Party, I haven't changed my ground at all. I believe that Parliament should be committed unequivocally to equal pay for work of equal value. Let's just see if we can improve this legislation to make sure that we take account of all the provincial experiences that have taken place, take account of everyone's experience, and see if it can't be improved. And I can assure the member from Toronto, the Toronto Trinity Spadina, who's my neighbour, I can assure her that we will be looking very carefully at the provisions that she's mentioned and see whether or not there aren't improvements that can be made. That's why we're there.
Resuming debate, l'honorable